my name is John, Associate Professor in for Climate Change Adaptation Research. In collaboration with Whitecloud, for the last 5 years now, we've been leading projects focusing on adaptation and tracking. Basically, asking the question, are we adapting to climate change? Trying to find out where change is taking place, kinds of adaptation are taking place. Adaptation is changing. We've got a number of projects that we're working on with adaptation. We're going to hear about how our research program has evolved over time from the early days of our students, researchers, staff members, adaptation projects, but getting on some specific projects going on. So her methodology, we're approaching adaptation projects along with some results as well. The first one was to have 10 minutes questions at the end, but leaving some of the bigger, overarching, or this kind of questions for the end. We present for maybe about an hour, and then that's the discussion. So I'd like to welcome our first presenter. Good morning.
Merci d'être venu. Je suis vraiment contente de venir ici et j'aimerais bien enregistrer pour le cabane. Oui, c'est fantastique. C'est une discussion du changement climatique et mes professeurs. Ça peut amener mes enfants aussi. Présenter en anglais, mais il y a plusieurs membres d'équipe, de notre équipe qui peut parler en français, qui sont bilingues. Ça peut être vraiment une réunion franglais, comme vous voulez. Soyez complètement confortable de demander des questions et de discuter en français. Ils vont répondre. Ça peut être quand une moitié de l'équipe est bilingue. Okay. Give you Okay, you can stay here. We'll give you a background of where this research came from, how it evolved. So the big questions that really give the research program here are these. Adapting to climate change, what adaptation look like on the ground, and track it. So mitigating climate change, while methodologically difficult, can, at least in theory, and is tracked quantitatively vis-a-vis greenhouse gas emissions. So this top right is full of how we can track greenhouse gas emissions and get a sense of progress on mitigation. Adaptation, so responding to the impacts of climate change, is much more difficult conceptually and methodologically. And we haven't really quantitatively, empirically, or even systematically, qualitatively systematically attended to a large extent to adaptation. There's a recognition, however, that this is important, and despite the difficulty, that we must at least attempt to do so. So this was or the vision for this research program is, can we begin to track adaptation systematically and get a sense of when we are adapting, we monitor adaptation, how do we know if we are adapting? So this will be, like I think, many great research ideas over one or more glasses of wine. James and I sitting around wondering if we could use systematic approaches to answer some of the grand questions of our time. And so somewhere prior to 2010, we came up with this question, are we adapting? So our first attempt to use systematic approaches in the health sciences, systematic literature review, to a social sciences question, and see if we could garner some early, even crude insights. In this case, we reviewed the peer-reviewed literature for looking for insights and whether there was evidence of adaptation. Focused on a very specific review question, review narrow literature, and used both quantitative and qualitative approaches to analysis. This was really our first attempt, our first take. And it took off. There was significant interest in the use of systematic approaches. And it was from this article and this idea that this research program has grown. In 3 years, we've on developing new applications, new methodological schools, see if we can do a job, always using systematic approaches to ask them about adaptation. Scales and sectors, so is there evidence for adaptation in civil society? What do adaptation initiatives look like provincially, federally, municipally? Look at data sources. So do results differ, or do we get different information from the peer literature versus gray versus policy documents? The answer is huge yes. Going beyond focus, we originally started predominantly looking mostly in the health sectors. We generalized from there. Developed our first metric, and level global adaptation index. This is admittedly, looking back, I think a crude index, but it was our first attempt to try and come up with an index with which to measure adaptation. Fairly controversial, even for us, but really tempting methodologically to see where progress can be made and go from there. We're trying to ask the harder question. So what does it actually look like? How do we know what adaptation? When do we say this is adaptation occurring? This is, in fact, sort of the million-dollar question. What adaptation actually look like on the ground? It's great in theory, but when you're on the ground trying to measure and trying to identify adaptation, it becomes much more tangible. And better, how to actually measure adaptation beyond just measuring reporting of adaptation, which is to a large extent where we are now, just measuring reporting on adaptation. We've recently longitudinal analysis of progress on adaptation. Look at adaptation, so based on theorized adaptive capacity. So what predicts whether which country are adapting? Is it just the wealthy countries or the wealthy cities that are adapting? Is it places with governance, places with strong leadership? We begin to look at the factors which actually predict which locations are adapting. And conceptualizing. So what are the conceptual insights we've learned from the last few years? And I'm going to focus just for a minute on one of these. This is some recent work we've done on what we call the 4 C's of adaptation tracking. And so this is based on systematic review approaches. And so beginning an operational definition of what we mean by adaptation and being consistent throughout a project. So if we're trying to do adaptation, we have to at least in an individual project define what that means. What is being compared? So we need data sets. We're actually comparing, and we're not comparing apples with oranges. We're comparing the same thing. So does this mean that we're at municipalities only? We're looking at specific equivalent documents between municipalities. We're comparing things that are comparable. We're not crossing units of analysis. Comprehensive is one of the tough ones. Data sets for which we actually have data. And one of the challenges, of course, has been that data sets tend to be more available in wealthy regions, and wealthy regions tend to adapt. So initially there is far less data for developing countries, for example. Those that don't adapt tend to have less information. What we don't know is there is no information because there's no adaptation, or if there's no information because there's no reporting. Data set. And ideally, like whatever we're measuring and whatever we're tracking, to actually appropriate reflection of adaptation. We want what to be informed to a large extent possible with adaptation theory. Now, there is no research that fills the 4 C's. These are aspirational, and they're huge trade-offs in trying to be comprehensive, systematic, consistent, and comparable. So we see this aspirational. We haven't achieved these ourselves. But this is guided most of the work that we're doing. So the students that will be presented are to a large extent guided by trying to achieve these. We've launched a consortium, which we call CCARG, Research on Adaptation to Climate Change. And this is really getting together with another young researcher, Robert Beesbrook at Wageningen University, who's trying to do similar work on tracking adaptation. So this launch is really starting to bring together those that are interested methodologically and conceptually on tracking adaptation to put our together for some of these grand challenges. And the factory was just launched late last year, and we have 3 pillars. The first is adaptation metrics. quantitative data sets and measures used to systematically track adaptation, and that's led by myself. Case focused on specific locations and sectors, and we're interested really in diving more deeply and getting more detailed data sets. So this would involve more participatory approaches, qualitative data, and led by James Ford, and theory. Really, to both be informed by metrics in our case studies, and that led by Robert. So what we'd like is a taste of three of the current projects going on in our lab, and we chose a range, including a national, and a territorial example to give you an idea of the scale we're at. I'm going to turn it over to James, who will introduce the various students to present, just to give you 3 taste tests of the types of things we're working on now.
Question. Before we okay, well, I'm speaking Malcolm. Malcolm's been a widow who joined us this year as a researcher. His master's work with us. Well, he's looking at station in urban areas over 1 million.
Introduction. So I'm going to present a global tracking study about adaptation taking place in urban areas. And so this is going to give you an example of how to put the conceptual account into operation. So I want to start a word what I mean by urban adaptation up on the slide. But I want to make the point that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified several impact directions to urban areas, such as heat islands, natural hazards, landslides. They have also identified individual human systems by infrastructure as the relevant area. And while the climate change, the sources of climate welfare is global, it has been argued are the closest examples of impact and equipped with knowledge of context vulnerability. From a self-survey of 2012, you can see other sense of progress in adaptation. Only 8% of urban bodies have reported quarantine adaptation time, and around 19% of urban bodies actually suspected of vulnerability assessment. Most globally. So for tracking urban adaptation, so the question is adaptation taking place in cities? Where, by whom, and in what ways? And so these questions are important to see that they tracking should be a baseline to measure future progress, as well as provide ability of transparency adaptation funds, which are both international and national. And answering this question, I'm facing 2 main challenges. One is how to define adaptation, right? How to define the unit of measurement. And second, to define the outcome of adaptation. So it's possible to quantify how much a city is adapted and define what adaptation is. So to tackle these logical concerns, I looked at 401 governments around the world, the global study. I used to choose these studies with these live criteria, so I only looked at live. So cities over 1 million people as defined for the United Nations definition of urban agglomeration. And I also used a language. So if 5 cities in language, I analyzed the of that language. Hiring translated to a small amount of cities. So the unit of variable across cities is climate adaptation planning document. So publicly available access to climate action plan, municipal adaptation plan. And I clarified urban adaptation along 2 axes: policy content, which refers to the goals and adaptation documents, using classifying adaptation initiatives, quantifying initiatives supported, and also classifying into the impact that it addresses, what types of activities there. Also, the policy process, 4, showing steps taken by the government to plan and implement adaptation policy. Next, I want to show you some findings. So a map of all the cities we actually sampled, around the world. We tried to have a good spread between the world and the global south. I'm going to use the map of the cities that actually aren't adapting. So around 80% of cities globally do not report any adaptation publicly. On the other extreme, we can extensive adaptation with a trial of report adaptation initiatives on a process for aging adaptation planning process. So you can see with cities are located in North America, Europe, and Australia. Durban in South Africa, Cameroon, and Indonesia. Vancouver and Toronto emerged as actually global leaders. Montreal is not far from this category. If you think of monsters, so adapting cities that reflect approximately median levels of adaptation supported Montreal falls. So a little bit of active program. And in profile, we can see there's more of a geographic mix also. So cities in South America, cities in Asia, more cities in South Africa report. Another profile that we define stage adaptation. So these are cities or governments that report some progress with adaptation process that actually do not report any implemented initiatives. So these have identified climate trends, projections in the future, vulnerability assessment. They haven't drafted a plan with concrete measures to reduce vulnerability to climate. I show you is the related policy content and policy process. So on the one on the left, you have the numbers that cities report. Factors on the bottom, you have the process. And graph you see that global as a pipeline. Vancouver is noted. Here is global leader, but Vancouver and Toronto actually very well. What do these say about the state of urban adaptation globally? The biggest takes on most large cities worldwide are actually not reporting adaptation to climate change. That this may be optimal state of urban adaptation, right? That involves diversity of impacted threats, different types of activities, both in terms of changes in behavior practice, but also in terms of capacity building initiatives and approach planning process. So undertaking vulnerability assessment, evaluation, and evaluating the adaptation. So the global leaders, we can take the profile and assess the adaptation. Another variation of adaptation within regions, right? So in South America, for example, we do see that actually cities are reporting climate change, which the classical notion that wealth is a limiting factor to adapt. So, for example, a high mode adapters. And so there's other factors for kind of local entrepreneurship and championship of climate change adaptation that might succeed to limit wealth. Only one word on the limitation. Those will be a significant challenge when we do these kinds of analyses. And the main thing I want to point out is maybe the reporting bias. Okay? So maybe I was able to analyze the way the climate change adaptation. They have a performance report, and I might be missing adaptation issues, level, household level, district level. So that's my point.
Any questions before you go?
there might be actually benefits of adaptation.
One thing that in this work, the other documents have really only a snap. Don't they capture all? It's not especially as we want to of like getting at application concentration relatively technical to the metric there. I don't know how to do you have to get proxy. Our proxy adaptation is reporting that on adaptation. I did how we got some stuff was get peer reviewed articles about results about proxy adaptation. And that for sure has a Malcolm work, more recent work, we've been trying to better more so Malcolm's work get that and pretty good we're still missing the world to be able to go to each of those urban areas, interview municipalities, do it that way. Well, that's really so we were on web so challenge always is that maybe say, hey, do well. But on your index where all we're doing it Malcolm's work skill.
Just for the aspects, pressure on the microphone, please. I do have a question, but it's not maybe to tracking of adaptation, but were you able to maybe assess what is driving municipalities to actually do adaptation? And I'm saying this because I started to work with the city of Montreal. The initial driver was the COP in Montreal 2005. That was the initial driver to start interest. Now, because we have the COP in Paris, there also seems to be a new interest in adaptation. Probably some that are interested because of impact. So, just wanted to your perception.
Yeah, so there's two things. One is you can look at individual cases, like pull out individual cases like Quito, for example, and as individually and look at the history of what's happened in Quito and see, okay, there's been a series of individuals that have championed this issue of climate change and actually been able to make them eager enough to be a leader in this area, and barriers. And there's some literature on that. We can talk about this later. Robert Biesberg writes a lot about this issue as well. The second, the actual next step in the study is to do a quantitative analysis of the drivers. So gather data for these maladies in terms of their GDP, their relation, hopefully our governance variables, and kind of do a process of what is happening in terms of maybe the number of initiatives. So if your corruption perception is lower, is the right number of adaptations, and that type of question. But this is still in the kind of developing stages.
Some of our previous at the global scale, we did look at well, like a guy called Frank Hauser. Of interest. Interesting things. Looking at litigation. That's the way I work on our work. This policy about tomorrow or other national. Next to that, Stephanie Austin. Stephanie joined us. She worked federal and regional scale.
Aujourd'hui, je vais vous parler de l'adaptation au changement climatique dans le domaine de la santé comme les juridictions canadiennes. Je vais commencer en français et puis je vais continuer en anglais. Le projet est né d'un contrat avec l'Agence du Canada. Vous m'avez déjà entendu parler du projet car j'ai présenté climatique à la podium URANOS. Et aussi en janvier, donc vous pouvez trouver en ligne si vous voulez. Donc, les grandes questions que ce projet a essayé d'adresser sont dans le santé. Quelle juridiction engendrer le plus niveau stable au niveau de l'adaptation? Comment le changement climatique dans le domaine de la santé se manifeste-t-elle sur le plan juridique canadien? Quelles sont les lacunes au niveau de l'adaptation de la santé au changement climatique au Canada? So to address these questions, we sample leveling the 13 cities territories and the 6 largest metropolitan areas and their encompassing health regions. Some of this work is only use publicly available information. For the federal, we have systematic web searches, and for the subnational levels, there's systematic keyword searches on their website. Primarily looking at adaptation plans, so we also included any websites or other documents related to adaptation. Among others, some of the variables we included are the type of adaptation being implemented, the health risks being addressed, and adaptation, and whether vulnerable populations are considered adaptation. So adaptation risks, we really parse them out three adaptation risks. So if I had an adaptation plan, I would include the plan as one initiative, and then each initiative within the plan as a subset. A lot of which is based on previous work done by our research group. So we'll jump right into the results. So here's the number of health adaptations I reviewed per territory. I'll just first that this shows the raw number of initiatives that I reviewed. We can't quite compare the weight of an adaptation plan to the weight of a single research project. So I look at the trends, not just but I think these trends are quite clear that Quebec is doing very well compared to other Canadian provinces and territories health adaptation climate change. And I'm sure people in this room are involved in that, so glad work so far. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here. So we realized to see how stark this graph was put it together. I'm surprised to see that Quebec is doing well in adaptation, but I think we're surprised the provinces are really in the early status and just how sharp this concept is. Justin's work actually has helped us understand a little bit why Quebec is doing well in provinces. Some of it has been impact of climate change, so the ice storms, flooding, and after that, a lot of public will innovation, and then in the 2006 OURANOS, which certainly contributed that we're seeing here. As to why we're seeing low adaptation in the rest of Canada, it's still unclear to be honest. In BC, for example, the conversation, BC is actually doing quite a higher adapt to climate change, but health really just isn't a priority. That's not where they're putting emphasis on adaptation. For other Alberta, we speculate that climate change and adaptation is a priority. It's interesting also to compare with the cities within these provinces and territories that we also looked at. So as Malcolm said, in Toronto, our global relative to other cities. We don't see very much happening in Ontario in health adaptation. In contrast, I did Montreal in our study, but we've only found 3 health adaptations for Montreal. Presumers, Montreal has an adaptation plan work, so I will see that changing later on. For now, it seems that Canadian cities adapt or not adapt economy to territorial level. As I mentioned, we'll look at the health regions of these specific metropolitan areas I looked at, which are Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. So find a single health adaptation from any of these health regions listed on. Seems to be a bit of a gap there as well. Now, if we compare the types of adaptation initiatives across scale, it comes out with some very interesting results. Here, average the provincial and territorial types of adaptation initiatives, as well as the local level. The federal level, in yellow, there's quite a lot of information type initiatives, information sampling type of research, a lot of capacity building in blue there. Type of initiatives that for example, like Health Canada series of event guidebooks for national or emergency management professionals, sort of thing. Whereas level, we're seeing a lot more practice and behavior initiatives, which is in purple there. So that would be sort of like developing refugees, for example, for events, right? Develop white roof initiatives to reduce the risk of island. Wealth of management planning and policy at the local. So that's, for example, having West Nile adaptation plan, or for example, having emergency plan bolstered for the second climate impact. If we break this into more simple, if we compare, if we all the adaptation initiatives reviewed, I think there's groundwork initiatives. So those are less direct initiatives that are more supportive, a lot of capacity building initiatives or research. And if we compare actions, that'd be more adaptation of those behavior initiatives that I mentioned. This is quite a jurisdictional pattern here. This is actually what we would expect that this is much more supported at the local level, where a lot of impacts are being felt, so we'll adapt more quickly. We're seeing a lot more adaptation. So some of the gaps lie in Canada's health adaptation climate as a lack of national adaptation. Canada's federal adaptation policy framework, but it outlines the role of federal government to adapt to climate change. It outlines their general approach that they want to focus on capacity building and research, but it doesn't provide concrete initiatives, what they're actually planning to do, how they're going to carry out adaptation, other levels of government, national level, how they'll work with partners. Whereas we do see that in others. We see that in Belgium, as the United States, all have adaptation planning. But as of yet, we haven't. We're also prioritization of planning. As I mentioned, not having adaptation planning. In contrast, for example, in the 2009, President Obama issued an executive order that federal agencies had to have an adaptation plan. And we're seeing a little bit of that out now in several in the United States health adaptation plans. But we don't see that as yet. Notice the lack of provincial and territorial vulnerability assessments. I only found 3 provinces with vulnerability assessments available online. And it's other provinces for completed vulnerability assessments but haven't posted on them. But that in itself can be problematic. It's not only the government using vulnerability assessments, but any kind of organizations that are also that try to help communities that now don't have available. Involved adaptation initiatives targeting vulnerable populations. So vulnerable populations context the elderly, anyone with pre-existing chronic conditions, those of lower socioeconomic status, and indigenous populations. And last, training and evaluation. That's not what we looked at in this study, but another study comparing monitoring and evaluation of adaptation at the federal level in OECD countries. At done some monitoring evaluation at the federal level, but it's also the Treasury Board Secretary of Canada criteria, and it doesn't actually answer any of the questions. We'd like to adaptation evaluation more with the stick to the budget, but it's not asking is this an adaptation strategy? Is this maladaptation? So the research can be applied in many ways. It can be extended to subprovincial level or sectors. In this study, I've only looked at Montreal and only the health sector. There's a possibility to expand research. A lot of possibilities for Quebec to be a leader within Canada and to years and experience with other provinces. Each province is very excited to reinvent the wheel, how to adapt it to the health sector. Lastly, there's a great opportunity for Quebec to be a leader in monitoring evaluation. Not a lot that's not about monitoring evaluation in public territories. So here's a great opportunity for Quebec to be that leader in monitoring evaluation. Some of the other research being doing with the has been adaptation at the federal level in OECD countries, and then monitoring, tracking whether the federal government has been evaluating adaptation. And we've also been tracking public health departments and are monitoring health indicators in their own group, so we can get a better idea of what are the impacts of climate change already being felt, and we can see the trend. Both projects funded by the public health system. And if you look at the study on health adaptation online, it's in the International Journal of Environmental Safety.
I think that point is definitely has a lot of interest of government policymakers. So those you can just find if and how adaptation given that this project focus is not local or national project, we have been able to do the validation. Are we capturing it? Looking at it, definitely all the positive points. And the health exercise is very obviously how complicated it is. It's in captures this that we are not with this validation of the okay, let's move on. Melanie, my research team I'll be looking at adaptation as location research. It's really an extension of work. Also, Melanie joined us in Melanie's an exchange student from the United Nations. She's going to be looking at specific adaptation as you evaluate. No. Fortunately, we didn't get it was going to be it links into
Merci James. Comme Sylvia, je vais commencer mon présentation en français pour quelques slides, donc je vais changer là, mais je me demander. Comme James a dit, le projet que moi et Valérie on travaille dessus, c'est une évaluation des initiatives d'adaptation de juridictions municipales, territoriales et fédérales dans les nouvelles. Alors, les questions axées recherche qu'on veut vraiment répondre, c'est à quoi la situation ressemble-t-elle? quelles mesures d'adaptation sont en place et quelle façon courante ces mesures d'adaptation se manifestent-elles en Nunavut? Et deuxièmement, est-ce que nous sommes de la bonne façon et est-ce que ces mesures sont couramment efficaces? Alors, pour répondre là, nos objectifs de recherche sont vraiment de décrire les conduites courantes de l'adaptation en Nunavut, faire des recommandations à ce que Nunavut peut faire pour améliorer ses efforts dans la demande de l'adaptation et dans les connaissances nécessaires au niveau de la préparation pour l'adaptation. Vraiment aussi dans le futur. Et quand je fais des initiatives d'adaptation, ce que je veux dire, c'est comme les politiques, les programmes et les actions d'adaptation au changement. So, because this is currently in progress, I've been working on it since fall. I don't have we're getting places. We don't have as many results to actually show to you. So I'm just going to basically what our project is aiming to do and an overview. So this project, we're working on it jointly, and it's a 3-part project. I'm going to walk you through each outcome, and each is actually a specific project. So the first one is creating an adaptation baseline, and this is the project is done, and a baseline for Nunavut. So I'm doing this automatic literature review, similar to the methods of Stephanie and Malcolm using, looking at publicly available talks online. So that would be reports, websites, project updates, anything I can find that is talking adaptation in a broad. And I try to expand beyond just adaptation as well, coping, different words to try to capture things that might and in just over 200 potential data sources, so that would be a website, and extracting the individual adaptation initiatives. So I'm still in the middle of just taking out all those just initiatives, so that would be like all of the different things in a plan. And so far I have just over 500 discrete adaptation initiatives in Nunavut, and I'm not done, so there's going to be more. So I'll have a data set, which is really exciting. And then thinking about this project is really the emphasis and kind of overall creating useful science that we're having. I really want to do a project that would be useful to the government of Nunavut and work with them kind of throughout the whole process. So we've been really trying to include stakeholder engagement. So at this, the baseline, creating with various stakeholders, so people from the Climate Center in Nunavut, Natural Resources Canada, Health Canada, even though we're here at OURANOS April, and I talked to her to redesign some of the questions that are included in the systematic review, especially working with the government of it, so that the questions are what they want to know and are what's actually talking about before, because I have a bit longer. I've been able to cross-check all of my findings and ensure that capturing all the things that I might be missing from the website. And so this is the second outcome, which is evaluation. And through the literature review, we identified a specific adaptation initiative that the government of Nunavut asked us to evaluate. So this is I'm going to talk to you about. She's a project lead on it. And so she's going to be creating a framework for evaluation and then actually applying it to a specific project at the level, which she will throughout this whole process. We've been working with stakeholders, so specific requests from the Nunavut Climate Center to evaluate this very specific project. We need to evaluate it. This is what would be useful for us. And then partnering with higher creation as well. Our third one is really look at the multi-scalar linkages. So this is a joint project that Melanie is working on together, and we're going to be putting the first each effective first project to try to create a bigger picture of adaptation in Nunavut to understand what's happening at all the different scales, so federal, territorial, and at the community level. We're going to be applying specific framework, adaptation readiness framework. We'll explain. And this kind of making this big picture was also a specific request from especially really like to see there. We know what's happening at all the different scales, but if you attempt at least to show us like a broad sort of diagram or kind of a concept map showing us how all of this is actually linking, that would be good. And we're going to be consulting with people throughout this process as well. So just a bit more information with what I have about my adaptation baseline. So we'll add that is, but baseline know provide kind of a current snapshot of adaptation data. So I'm trying to do this in a bit. And yeah, as we mentioned, this is fairly possible to do, and we have kind of guidelines for the emissions, but we don't have this adaptation. We really wanted to try to do this smaller scale territorially for Minnesota. So that visualizes how adaptation is happening over territory, and kind of this having this baseline that once it's created, I wanted to like you could replicate this study in 5 years, 10 years, and actually track the progress of adaptation is occurring in the territory. Or so this is creating is answering, providing information on three questions. So who is actually adapting? So looking at which sectors are adapting, which communities are adapting, secondly, what actually adapting to. So at both the climatic and non-climatic stressors. So whether it's like heat change or permafrost change or non-climatic changes in traditional soil or economic marginalization, that's like an actually track what are the biggest kind of concerns. And then finally, adaptation actually occurring. So getting into a bit more detail, what types, I'm using a similar methodology to what Stephanie Malcolm used, like capacity building, information, research. Data at the stage, whether it was groundwork or action, looking at if it was active or reactive. So I have to pull through each question that I'm going to provide information on and put this all together. Yeah. Okay, so second part of the project, my part is the creation of the adaptation framework. And already discussed, adaptation is already underway in Minnesota. There are 5 already ongoing or a plan. As about earlier on in the second presentation, there's very little being at the moment. Just monitoring and evaluation and adaptation it's still a very novel process. There's very limited evaluation sector. Despite the fact that the value of adaptation is often complex, learn and improve adaptation. The result is seeing this gap and create monitoring and evaluation framework, partnership with local stakeholders, so in the local climate change centre, and it's also planning and land as the government got creating it with people who are applying to brain analysis projects and art. I'm not going to get into the projects that we're evaluating right now. I'll talk about that later on. So the whole have this adaptation framework on this project. And then for members of climate framework and applying the adaptation projects that have ongoing so that they can use monitoring and evaluation to evaluate them. Finally, together, Jill and then myself, we're doing this adaptation framework. And so this framework really determines what is actually being managed. Does this using these 6 factors? And these are sort of the overarching factors that we have spot allocation. We also have institutional organization, form of a collaborative or an organization for we also have science factor here. Science factor is the pertinence of information, the quality of information, the timeliness of information is being fed through decision making, timeliness, and able to react to it. And also because we're more in context here, we're going to try and include traditional knowledge and factors. We then go to decision making, also stakeholders. As a top down or as a we then go on to other adaptation really driving forward adaptation. And finally, we also have public support. So this links very much to what Stephanie was saying about tech and extreme events might have happened that maybe brought adaptation on that college adaptation. So it's really pushing forward people being aware and transferring for adaptation. So the hope is to be able to consider these factors to build a big picture of adaptation in none of us, trying to find the barriers between factors and the scales themselves, and to look at how information and adaptation scales. So finally, just to give you a quick overview of the take-home message from our part of the these methodologies can be applied across knowledge and analysis. First part of the project is baseline creation. This is a systematic methodology which allows comparability of scales. Territorial scales, which happens none of us in Northwest Territories, can also actually take that information so how is it doing now, how is it doing in 5 years from now. In addition to that, you can focus in a little more. You could use this baseline methodology to look simply at research organizations, private sector, or NGOs, and really look at who is adapting to what. Secondly, the evaluation framework, as we've already gone to define different adaptation projects create. And really the great is because it's so novel, you can use the pilot project to apply those lessons learned, really create a great adaptation framework. And the adaptation readiness framework allows us to do the big picture and to be considered not just none of what is involved in the provinces and to be able to give a good adaptation for
Since it's at a coastal scale that you're working, how do you plan to integrate maladaptation? Because I work on the coastal zones and we see plenty of it, and it's really the root of adaptation and how to integrate it.
That's a good question. To be I'm not 100% sure yet, and that's something I've been talking about with because I don't know myself. Like, I don't want to project like what or my maladaptation or So I guess I've been trying that in terms of really working with people to understand and even doing interviews, kind of beyond. So we're doing the systematic review, the adaptation readiness, talking to people on the ground about adaptation, about what are the challenges, what is this working, what does maladaptation mean, how do we overcome this, like how is this being taken into account to kind of add a bit more of a qualitative in-depth part. I think it's been that just from like statisticalizing reports and sites and things like that, because often it would just be mentioned in like when or not mentioned at all because they're kind of trying. A lot of the things are like really planned, just like we should do this, but and you don't know if it's implemented, you don't know if it's led to maladaptation. So I think it's hard. No, on radar. I'm wanting to specifically ask about that, and I think kind of evaluating the being able. Well, you can. I don't know. Evaluating the project and trying to does this adaptation. With like the terrain analysis, was it? How did it actually play out on the ground? What do community members think about this? What do planners think about this? How does the product manager feel? To kind of see what elements of maladaptation in this? How can this be over? Or how was that taken taken into account. So we understand it with like at least one specific initiative to start, and kind of seeing where to go from there. That answers your question. I think a little bit. We are doing interviews with different stakeholders at the local level. There is kind of maladaptation within the interview questions. I think the really interesting thing about the adaptation readiness framework is the consideration of the linkages. It is the opportunity to be able to see whether things are flowing down properly and linking between levels as they should do, and that might be able to really highlight where maladaptation might be potentially occurring if people are speaking to each other and things aren't made through as we expect them to.
Have any? I mean, I'm very open. I love getting people's opinions about things. I'm not an expert by any means, and so if you have any ideas of how they address or how to incorporate it, we're happy to get feedback as well.
Adaptation is a tough one. Trying to have the idea of adaptation, effective adaptation. We started at the local scale, national scale. We basically document adaptation. Each have its own role in an organism. Examine the kinds of adaptation that those kind of things. Increasingly, we're trying to get out success. So not just looking at the number, looking to see if they're good at it. So far, crudely, is by looking at what groundwork actions or we're trying to develop adaptation. We're trying to get at adaptation. Like the issue of maladaptation. Existing work, the potential options document. We've not carried out. Looking at maladaptation, of my work in Europe, many people describe things such as the changing location of hunting. Right, if that adaptation is similarly maintain shelter. There's in the shelter. Not long to know that maladaptation is a question, one that even also research. Work with it. Well, it's used. Knowing whether adaptations and all that stuff is a challenge. Which might not be.
You mentioned 5 adaptation initiatives in Nunavik. I remember. What are your criteria to decide this adaptation initiative? Because we get a bunch of people around the table that say we should do this and that. And go on the field and change the house building codes and patterns of roads to travel on ice. There are safety criteria. So, at what side, okay, the adaptation and not.
And yeah, the decision that I've struggled with too, because it's good on paper when you have your, well, this is my definition of an adaptation initiative. Policy, program, action, government-driven, it's addressing my definition of adaptation and specifically mentioning climate change. So but then when you start reading docs, it's not as clear as what you wrote kind of Word document and thought it was going to be very easy. So yes, that's something that I've basically, I've been using my definition, and then it is, I guess a bit subjective as well in terms of is this what I consider adaptation happening? Is it addressing climate change? And I didn't look at each specific kind of action. So, for example, changing a municipal, but that would be one. And building, I don't know, we're going to build a seawall. That could be one initiative. Having a meeting about something like that could be, and it would be an initiative as well. Or even if I'm looking at an adaptation plan, often the adaptation plans that are existing in Nunavut, they're broken either like different sectors or different like community actions, rural actions, and have like kind of with each different suggested kind of initiative. So I've coded like each single one of those things in discrete action because I'm able to have kind of all of them. And if you're just looking at one plan and there's like 50 different things in the plan, then how do you know? How do you really know what's actually going on? But then I've been really like classify what type of adaptation it is, whether it's capacity building, information, structural building, which of them have been, if I can, a lot of them are capacity building initiatives or very like hard adaptations, build or changing bylaws and stuff like that. And then I also really wanted to look at the status. So it's really difficult to see what actually been implemented. Like it's all well and great to say, oh, there's over 500 things discussed. We should do this, but it's really hard to tell if actually being implemented. So into a lot of planned where there's like it's in the plan and they have a timeline for it and maybe a few people who are dedicated to be in charge of putting this. It's very difficult to tell if it's actually been done, and the majority of the initiatives that I've actually coded, like of that 500, are just in the planned stage. So I don't know yet. Like there definitely aren't 500 things that are actually happening around. A lot of it is just this would be useful. A lot of those are coming from the adaptation plan. I'd say those are the docs that have the most things. And that answers your question.
There's definitions out there of what adaptation is. Projects is where we're clear specifically what we mean by adaptation. In the work, adaptation is some kind of purposeful response to climate change. That might be everyone. That's the definition that we use. So we've got some intentionality, like climate change is a motivator, and that these responses are in part, if entirely, due and responding to climate change impacts. It's clear in terms of that definition. We often give examples in terms of what is and what is not adaptation in our conceptualization. Very important that you're transparent, so that when people look at our results, they know that this is focusing on specific kinds of adaptation, defined responding directly to climate change impacts. Distance, a key component when looking at adaptation, say globally, that we're using that definition of adaptation across, say, all those municipalities that we're looking at. And that kind of underpins the 4 C's of adaptation, which Leah mentioned at the beginning. It's an important question, because someone else's definition of adaptation could have very different results. Some people, for instance, think that development is adaptation. Say low-income countries that just investing in poverty eradication, sustainable development is adaptation. Or disaster action is adaptation. But we're not those in our work unless they're labeled specifically as having a climate change component in them. Hang on, we've got a few slides left now. What we've shown this morning is a few samples of some of the work going on within the Track 3 program. There's also other projects as well that are currently underway. So for instance, Alex Lesnikowski, who Alex worked with us for TERS, when we were just getting this work off the ground. She's also going to start a PhD with me in the fall. And she's at the moment working for us, looking at adaptation progress. So it's like, how is adaptation changing over time? In study work, she created the baseline of adaptation, health context, by looking at adaptations reported UNFCCC national communications. She looked at 5s to characterize what adaptation were taking place in the health sector. We've now got the NC6s have been released, whereby 40 developed nations reporting on what they're doing in part adaptation. And looking at those NC6s to see if there's change in types and characteristics of adaptation taking place in the health sector. So she's developing a methodology for that and actually seeing how things have changed over time. Work ongoing by Robert Beesbrook, one of our collaborators and key track 3 leads in Holland, and looking at how different administrative structures affect adaptation policy. So here in Canada and the US, we have federal structures, quite decentralized in terms of how we're addressing things like climate change adaptation. Compare European context where in countries like the UK, we have more of a centralized structure of governance. What this work is look globally and say how do different administrative traditions or structures, how do they affect the types of adaptation taking place? Those are the number of adaptations, their characteristics, and also their potential effectiveness as well. Then put a project ongoing by Maya Sherman. Maya's worked with us now for a few years. And looking at this question of what is adaptation in income nations? Adaptation differ from development? She's answering those kind of questions. And that is very important if we track adaptation. Because knowing what adaptation is, when we see it, is the thing that we need to really state. So we get those kind of debates in lower income things. But just about funders, the work has been funded so far by the Public Health Agency, Health Canada. All there is SHRC and CCARG, who've also funded this work as well. Just by noting some of what we see as the grand challenges in adaptation research, I just want to hand this over to Leah to finish this.
So I'm an analyst. I'm trained in quantitative analysis. I like my data sets to be very clean. This is so frustrating and exciting research program for me. Nothing is clean when you try and quantify adaptation. One would even question whether it's what should be undertaken at all. And a lot of the grand challenges arise from this. The first is, can we achieve the 4 C's of adaptation tracking? So really systematic tracking adaptation while using reporting bias. I think many of you will feel slight discomfort with some of the methods we're talking about because there's just inherently so many biases in here. I first started this that we won't that our research is successful when people back at our first articles and talk about how terrible our methodology was because we're doing so much better. I think very much we do see our what in that way that even if we start crudely, this is a path that we have to begin to methodologically grapple with, even if we're only launching other people to do a better job. And we are amongst what we the crowd to improve our adaptation tracking. And so that's where we're going. There's just huge changes for reporting bias and methodological constraints to the based on the data that are available. But we won't think the adaptation challenges significant to justify the effort. What is the analysis for adaptation tracking? I'm not talking about city versus country versus province here. I'm talking about when an adaptation start and begin. Is an adaptation a program? Is it a discussion? How do we decide what an adaptation is? In our early work, a unit of analysis was a peer-reviewed paper, a policy commitment. Unit of analysis for adaptation is very, very different because there are fuzzy boundaries around adaptation is. There's no unit unless we want to be very creative and develop something equivalent to the disability adjusted life years, a health unit. Somebody go out and be very creative here to think of a unit of analysis would look like an adaptation. What new data is feasible to achieve improved adaptation tracking? I think we'd like to think not about what data sets are already, but what data sets we could create. So can we fit in, we're saying for developing countries, et cetera, can we consider where data could be achieved from? We're looking at, for example, web scraping, Twitter, different types of locations, and even whether we could take some of Malcolm's work, for example, and do grant validation, actually interviews to begin to triangulate and validate some of our data sets. Evaluate adaptation. This is arguably the ultimate stage. if you have work and then you have action, the next would monitoring evaluation. We almost don't even look for that because there's just not enough of it to cope. But ultimately, what we need is monitoring evaluation. We need to know how to do it, and we need to actually do it. So this is what we're starting to grapple with, and this relates to the last question, which has already bubbled up today, which is, can we measure effectiveness? Really, what we're doing right now is measuring. We're just inching as close as we can get to proxies of adaptation. But to actually measure effectiveness, before we can do it methodologically, we would even need to conceptualize this. And I don't even think we're conceptually there. What we're trying to do in our research is the early stages, which is measuring reporting of adaptation. Ultimately, we want is effectiveness. I think this is the meatiest question that we're getting at, and this relates to our third C, which is least motive C, coherence, which is getting as close as we can to getting proxies, which can do a job of proxying whether adaptations are real, and that's what that means. So these are our grand challenges guiding us. Some of them we're more or less successful on, and these are the types of things that keep us at night, and maybe for some of you as well. And we're happy to always have discussions and feedback and glasses of wine. Thank you. This last slide.
You want to take other questions or questions? None or people are hesitating, I will start.
First to start with a comment is that, there's the Climate Change Action Plan, $0.7 billion, 2013, 2020. Out of this $2.7 billion, there's $200 million that are tagged addition, including some funding for OURANOS project. There's two phases. One is 2013, 2017, and 2017, 2020. So in 2017, the government is supposed to do a review. So if you in 2011, 2012, the Directeur Général that the government with respect to greenhouse gas, why they spent a lot of money to try to reduce greenhouse emissions. Quebec reach its target, but it's not clear if it's because of the action or because of something else, like an economic crisis along the way. And for adaptation, they basically had nothing against. And so then after that, there was initially a big fuss around trying to have targets even for adaptation. And then it seems to be going down a bit. And I suspect that in 2017, it's back again. Count the governments and the ministries because they're not really developed that much control. That was my comment because it'd be interesting to see. And it's one of the reasons why OURANOS is actually interested in this type of work because it's probably a good idea to try to develop some form of metrics for 2017. The question is, we hear all the time for mitigation, for science, for adaptation. That is ahead. And I was in Paris last week, and it sounded nice because there was some media people, even some high political people, and they seemed to discuss change, mitigation, adaptation, and it sounded very nice. But it's not clear to me if on the ground they are really ahead on adaptation compared with some of the other countries. So I wanted to hear you about whether it is true that, again, on a climate change file, Europe is ahead or not.
I mean, from some of your work there, you've been looking at the OECD nations and some of your work in a health context. I think the health context is one where Europe is not leading. I think the question you need to break down by different sectors. I think a lot of our work does show is that certainly Europe, there are some sectors where Europe is leading. But health, I don't think, is one of them. Stephanie, do you want to maybe explain some of your work on health?
actually just finished up some of my data collection on adaptation in the health sector in 10 OECD countries. So any OECD countries which are French as an official language. Those are the languages that I speak. Leaders in that I found, we're still quite a little bit of numbers, but now that the U.S. has released their health adaptation plans in the Department of Human Health and Social Services, I found they're actually leading, if we're just looking at the raw number of initiatives, again, there's much more to it than just that, but that's the stage I'm at with the research so far. Switzerland is actually doing very well also. They just released a second adaptation plan, I believe, year as well. And Canada's not far behind. Canada's up in there too. But I think a little bit more what it comes down to is some of the types of adaptation that I showed you. So these initiatives that we're talking about, whether they're information and research, they have adaptation plans, whether it's practice and behavior on the ground. And so, keeping the sample. We don't have quite as high just a raw number of initiatives I've reviewed, but have much more practice and behavior initiatives. They have the highest number of practice and percentage, I should say, practice and behavior initiatives at any of the countries that I looked at to the federal level. So it's a little bit unusual seeing that at the federal level, especially France isn't a small population either. We do that a little bit as well with Luxembourg and Belgium, but again, these are a little smaller, so it makes a little more sense. The United States has some very good plans. They have very good extreme heat event plans, for example. But a lot of it comes back to what James was talking about and some of our colleague in the Netherlands, Robert Biesbroek, is working on. With different administrative structures, it's quite hard to compare. When we're seeing a lot more plans at the national level, in the United Kingdom, for example, within their own administrative structure. But within Canada, much as currently doesn't have a strong adaptation plan or doesn't have a health adaptation plan, it's difficult within Canada since under Canada's constitution, health and environment are both devolved responsibilities at provincial and territorial levels. So it's difficult to responsibility for both implementing adaptation initiatives, but also who should pay for it. So those are some big challenges there. So instead of saying here, I think it's more interesting to look at these kind of adaptation profiles. Like Malcolm had profiles for each city, for example, but that's one thing I'm considering of looking at the federal level for adaptation, kind of coming between this approach of more capacity building information like Canada and the U.S., or taking a much more centralized, much more management planning, much more practice and behavior route like the United Kingdom and France, for example. Really say concretely who is the leader, and I'm a little cautious that just by using the number of adaptation initiatives we reviewed. But it's a mix. I think that there are leaders in Europe as well as Canada. And of course, that's only going across the federal level. Within that analysis, I'm not comparing Quebec to other countries, for example.
So my question is, by doing the kind of approach that we've used, the number of initiatives going on, categorizing them, examining them, and seeing which did perform well against, based upon the number of adaptations taking place, they're able to document. Also, which has also been used, some guy called Eric Massey in Holland has used this approach, is looking at a policy field, asking the question, is adaptation a policy field? And they define a policy field as basically a mature, there's institutions, a research, a whole network which is adaptation. So it's just a model issue. It's stream, specific departments and specific mandates which require action on adaptation. There's a whole community of actors, of researchers, of NGOs, of civil society, of boundary organizations, of governments. It's with adaptation that as their mandate. What they did is they looked at, I think, 40 European countries and asked the question, to what extent is a policy field in evidence for adaptation? And I found, performance did vary on a national basis, but the one nation that really stood out was the UK in terms of, and the role of UK SIPDA has played a very important role, along with strong government leadership in moving adaptation onto the forefront. Now, there's been studies looking at to what extent adaptation is a policy field here in Canada. or the US or elsewhere, so it's hard to compare. But certainly would be an interesting approach to take, is to use that kind of methodology and see how Canada and other countries stand up with policy field framing. So it's a different way of answering the question.
There are a lot of adaptations that do not show up the documents. A few examples that come to my mind is in northern Quebec, there was initiative to charts tentative ground because of permafrost melting, and are being used by municipalities to plan their housing developments and things like that. Not necessarily encrusted in policy. In a coastal zone, for example, in Hudson Bay, we have done studies to create synthetic ties of extreme water level there, but now they'll be used for planning port and all kind of the coastal streets. So these things, you got government documents, you may see any kind of adaptation, but currently used by a large number of people to us their way of building things. Do you have plans to see what is not the document and this part of the adaptation side?
So I mean, that's one of these grand challenges is adaptation which is out there. Not even talking about effectiveness, but the adaptations which are actually happening. What we're really attempting to do is bridge these scenarios where we can do very local case-based study, interviews, finding those documents. So we can access those simply because there's human capital and capacity that knows about what's going on the ground. So those are accessible. Those are not accessible will allow us breadth. We can get breadth through publicly available searches, and we can get depth by working in a particular location. What is difficult to get is breadth and depth at the same time. So in this case study, when we do case study research, we can get at that because we're talking to people on the ground, so we can really find out everything that's going on. Some of the work by one of our colleagues, Tristan, who's come to the system for a particular location for a territory or a town. Tristan's work, I believe it was for a particular town. Systematic review, the site, looking at documents, any documents in the town, doing interviews with stakeholders, you can really fill in the entire picture and get that information. What you can do is get that for all cities globally. Talking about can begin to do that. So can we, for example, use Malcolm's work of looking at publicly available documents for municipalities, as well as can we interview, can we Skype, can we phone, and I asked what else is going on. Can we use Twitter? Can we use online scraping to find it there to actually get dimensions such as discussion with that region about climate change? So the information's there. It's a matter of accessing it in a way that allows us to be systematic, and that's what we're trying to get at. And ultimately, what some of our research does when we choose breadth, what we get is proxies. So we don't find that stuff. We hope, for the worst, that the proxies that we do have, that the stuff that we do find is representative of all the stuff that we're missing. I think we also like that we can have an influence on the increased publication or visibility of activities that are going on that are not labeled to increasingly be able. Our research is very easy to game. Very easy to game. If a province or a city looks at our research, they could very easily label what we're doing as adaptation, and we think there's value to it. Because we can't find it. There may be other people that can't find it for whom it is useful. I think that there is value reporting, not just being a bias, but reporting being important to itself.
What we're trying to do as we move forward as well is validation. slide data set from Malcolm of 401 urban areas, of which about 90 of them are doing some kind of adaptation. What we want is zoom into, say, a few cities that are adapting or adapting moderately. At least, what did we miss there? Into those municipalities, and we in-depth on the ground research, we took people, we get all the information going on. What has what we missed, but if it includes stuff we missed, there's damage to the results in the findings. We're trying to do, as one of our goals as we move forward, is to do this validation at scales, whether it's a global scale analysis or whether it's a national scale analysis, just to see what are we missing and does that affect the results? We don't know yet. I do miss stuff, for sure we miss stuff, we acknowledge that. But important is that for the results that we get in terms of the trends that we're finding.
Interestingly, we have validated between peer-reviewed gray and policy documents and found that the differences in these fundamental results and trends are huge. Not talking about tiny differences. If you ask the same question of the peer-reviewed literature and the gray literature, talking about huge differences, reversals of trends. So this is something that we're starting to think, in order either going to have to create new data sets or triangulate or explicitly recognize the bias in the data set that's collected. One of the we published recently actually talks about what methodologically is needed in a systematic and system review, and one of the things absolutely has to be discussion of the implications of bias and understanding what data sets you're using and what that means for bias, because even our research has shown that the data you use in many cases drive the results. Is biases out there. So if anything, on reporting on adaptation globally, what you find is English language countries look doing more. And so countries for which English is not a primary language, it's hard for the report. And we were not just looking at English. I'm talking about if we look at global publishing in all languages, English countries are dominant. So there is a global linguistic bias on communication and reporting of adaptation, period. We haven't grappled with that at all, but it comes out either explicitly or implicitly in almost everything we've seen.
I've heard the voice of Roger Street, which is in the UK, and I think he had a question, so I don't know if you can hear Roger, you can unmute your moment, ask your question.
Len, thanks very much for the patient. I've really enjoyed this. This is a big, challenging area, as was mentioned, and there's a lot of questions: why this, why that, and a number of other things. Adaptation is a complex issue that we need to really grapple with, and we need to start looking at how to understand the progress that we're making. And so I very much appreciated the chance to hear some of the work that you're doing. The questions that I have going on this is that looking at adaptation. If you look at adaptation as a learning process, then working on it becomes even more complex, because we know that some of the adaptations we're putting in place today will not be effective, or actually will end up to be maladaptation in the future. So how do you take that into consideration, the temporal nature of adaptation? Looking at one of the other complex things that I'm trying to wrestle with is really trying to understand adaptation in some countries is lesser level than other countries, yet it is appropriate for what their context. So I look at this in Europe, for example, and in Europe some countries are further ahead than others, but the countries that are further behind, mainly because for a number of reasons that they're behind, but the adaptations are valid and they're making steps forward, and that needs to be recognized. So that adds to the complexity of it. And there's a couple of interesting things. One of the things that we did in Europe is I was involved in looking at national adaptation policies across Europe in different European countries, and there was a report that's put out recently trying to better understand this and where that policy process is. And also trying to, there's another one that's being developed now that is looking at monitoring, reporting, and evaluation. And that report will be out by the end of this year, because as we know, Europe is going into a reporting focus. And so they're looking at those types of things. But the thing that I find interesting is in the UK here, we have another process, and it's somewhat linked to the difficult process, but it's the adaptation subcommittee that has to scrutinize the role of government in adaptation. And that scrutiny role is something they take very seriously. And their first report is coming out in July. So that'll be interesting to look at in this context and how it happens. How what you're trying to do, I think it may help inform that. One comment I will make is that in the UK is a lot more complex than people actually realize. The UK is a system, it has 4 nations, and adaptation to aspects of it are at the UK level, but other aspects are also at the nations level. And it is a devolved issue. And then also what's happened in the UK, because of the way this government is going, adaptation is also being devolved to the local authorities. And so it's that layer of complexity that I think that needs to be looked at. But that's not only true in the UK, is there's other countries within Europe where I'm noticing that difference. That there is adaptation is actually at the cities level, but also there's regional aspects, such as in Germany and in Spain. We see the very strong regional nature of adaptation and trying to get understanding it at that level and being able to track it is difficult. I do another comment I want to make. I do also agree that this issue of the English bias is something we're going to always be challenged with, and this is where we're going to have to make some progress on doing that. And I'm seeing a lot of work being done in China that's not being reflected. Some of it comes out through the IPCC, but I think that there's activity going on where they now have a requirement for provincial adaptation plans within the next 5-year planning cycle. And so all provinces within China will have adaptation plans. So it'll be quite interesting to see how that develops. Other things that need to be looked at, and I think that this is a useful first step. I really appreciate hearing how you're doing, and I hate the challenges you're trying to address too.
Thank you for those comments. Follow on a couple of the points, and then I'll let James answer, specifically China and longitudinal analysis. It's funny that you should mention China. This has been, elephant in the room of evidence for what is going on. China rising. You can't talk about global adaptation really without thinking about some of the major global economies, and it's largely absent from a lot of the data sets that we're accessing. Malcolm's work for global cities has a huge number of the great global cities, over 1 million people. So what was the proportion, Malcolm, in the data set that's represented by China? But how many were Chinese? So about 1/4 of cities in the data set were Chinese cities. Major influence, but we don't have data on China for many of our data sets. And we actually, except for Malcolm, we actually tried to recruit a student to focus, do a systematic review at multiple scales, specifically on what adaptation looks like in China. That funding actually didn't go through, but that's been one of our priorities, is to do case studies directed on China and to begin filling that gap. The longitudinal.
The 12th fifth-year plan, which was tabled, I think, last year or the year before, I can remember. There was the time that you saw adaptation actually mentioned in the 5-year plans of some of the provinces and at the China level as well. But I know that they now have a requirement for provincial adaptation plans for the next 5-year planning cycle. So you'll see a lot more information that will be available.
I think we could have a whole subcommittee actually investigating some of these I would call them missed economies in many data sets. I also comment on changes. So the point about some countries making progress but being at an earlier stage, that's going to come up in our results. For example, Malcolm talked about early adapters, so cities are actually participating in the planning process but we don't have practical adaptations yet. So identifying these are not laggards. These are these that are really at an appropriate stage of their work. I've also seen in longitudinal research done by Alex that that we look at the countries, the OECD countries that have made, or the X1 countries that have made most progress on adaptation based on our evaluation of the NC National Communications 5 and 6. Countries with most progress are actually the countries that fared the poorest in the beginning because they had the most progress. There was the most room for improvement. So I think longitudinal analysis is really where we need to go, looking at progress on adaptation. So not who are the leaders and laggards, but also where did a country begin and where does it go. So this idea of baseline data from which we can monitor. Longitudinal analysis is going to be strongest, at least methodologically. This is my epidemiologist talking again. Methodologically, longitudinal analysis is going to be the most rigorous method we can actually use to track adaptation. It allows us to control for some of our biases and can allow us to look at different nations from where they began. But this is the first time. We have to do baseline studies in order to do longitudinal. We're only beginning to be able to do that. Did you want to mention some other stuff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the question about maladaptation, I think, is an important one, and certainly, keeps trying to find better ways to really capture the effectiveness component of adaptations taking place. In our early work, we developed this adaptation index, which is a great measure of looking at the ratio between adaptations that were groundwork versus those that are more concrete. And as we've been toying with different ways of doing it, for instance, Robert Biesbroek at Wageningen has been, proposed a number of ways of characterizing adaptation. He had a paper a few years back, I think last year, where he says adaptation as being symbolic or concrete. Basically, a bit of way of characterizing adaptation to try and get at the effectiveness component. So we sort of like different ways of characterizing adaptation to really get at that effectiveness and to really bring in the maladaptation. But that will most likely continue to be a significant challenge, especially at the global scale where to evaluate adaptations from the perspective of maladaptation will be quite difficult. Another point, Roger, was about looking at between nations, with some nations maybe reporting less progress. I think the thing we've been trying to do as well is when we look at specific nations, not just looking at the total number of adaptations, because different nations face different risks. Look at the impacts of climate change, for instance. Some nations which will be much more affected than others. So they're for sure they for sure should be doing more adaptation than those who have low risk profiles. So what we do in our work, I've been trying to do, is really look at the adaptations that are taking place, their type, their focus, and compare them to the risks that climate change poses. So are the adaptations targeted at the most important risks? Are adaptations targeting the populations who are most vulnerable to those projected risks? That's the global scale assessments. Something the more regional ones that we've done, that's something we've been trying to do.
I don't know, or just a naive thought, to go with it. About adaptation, measure adaptation effectiveness. Behind adaptation is a link, between climate stressors, like you said earlier, and cost, financial cost, a strong impact. For given stress, probably different community will respond with potential of adaptation, and well, so far, someone keep on monitoring this link between the stressor and an adaptation is totally helps also to avoid some costs. So do you know if this storing is still going on, because it was the list for from an historic of so if you just keep on monitoring the same thing, is at lose somehow. And having said that, for stressor of the adaptation effectiveness will be somehow linked to the detection problem also. So at a certain point, things should start to be correlated, the stressor and the impact of that stressor.
That wasn't a naive question at all. So you're talking about is referred to, this is epidemiologic terms, but the causal contribution of climate to what health outcomes or otherwise. And there's literature, there are whole fields attempting to correlate how many of global malaria deaths can we attribute to climate change. What has been the cost of climate change on infrastructural damage due to extreme weather events? So there is a sort of a huge body of literature attempting to do that. Just this morning, I'm writing an article to these ideas, so it's very fresh in my mind. Very weak literature. So attributing causality to climate change or even weather is dubious scientific endeavor, which has struggled and will continue to struggle and will never be resolved. And this is coming from someone who's attempting the stuff we've just presented to you. That is climate change impact manifest through social processes. So extracting, how many deaths or how many dollars are due to climate change and they are due to other stuff is actually conceptually impossible. From an epidemiology perspective, we call this effect modification, which means the impacts of climate change don't just interact with, but are changed by the processes. Some research, some pretty high-profile examples like the European heat wave. So where we're actually trying to, so some nice, I would say nice, pretty examples which allow us to attempt that and think that we can aspire to doing that. I think in reality, moving forward on adaptation, we won't rely on that science giving us what we want. We probably have to proceed with the muddier waters, likely not having good research on contributions of climate change, because in most cases it's not being clean, and also waiting baselines while climate is changing and while we're adapting, other things are happening. Raging debates, for example, with malaria research about what has caused contractions and expansions of malaria, whether it's climate versus social factors. And these are for very easy, conceptually easy impacts. The associations between malaria and climate are very simple. For involved political, social, economic processes, it's much more complicated. And I would venture to say that that's the research that solve the problems we solve in answering adaptation questions as much as we want them to and should. I don't think that that's where the answers are going to come from. We can continue to try, and we should, with these adaptation questions. How much can we attribute to climate change, and can we make projections? But it's a pretty tricky area, and I don't think it will become any less tricky.
The last question, maybe. In your adaptation readiness framework you're applying in Nunavut, you have a series of components or criteria, I don't know how you call them, but sort of guidelines you need to address during this the work. And I noted that some of them, except the one on traditional knowledge, most of them are not specific to the North or Northern community or Northern environment. So am I to think this framework eventually could be used or applied not just in the North, but maybe in other regions, actually maybe everywhere in Canada, and even maybe to evaluate adaptation readiness in some specific sectors or activities?
Yeah, no, definitely. This is a framework that I developed with this is a very general framework that we didn't develop for the North. It's a paper that I did with Diana King a few years back now. Basically, adaptation readiness is about looking to what extent students are prepared to adapt. what we identify is a variety of components which we believe are indicative of preparedness. So, is funding in place to support adaptation? Are decision-making structures in place to facilitate adaptation? Is there political leadership in place? So a variety of components which the scholarship indicates are indicative of a human system being ready to do adaptation. This is applicable at multiple scales. To apply it globally to certain sectors, to certain regions. Our work is trying to apply this in practice in the universe to see if it works. Conceptual. With the paper where we propose this, it's a conceptual paper. We don't actually apply it to see, does it work, is it feasible? What we do for each of these is identify a set of indicators that we can measure. That's indicative of a territory becoming ready for adaptation. So the work that we've done is very much piloting it to see if it works, is it useful, are the insights worthwhile? But it's applicable at multiple scales and multiple sectors, and that's what I'd like to see in the long run ended up applied, globally. I think adaptive capacity measures the capacity to adapt. It's a theoretical potential. What this adaptation readiness captures is actually what's going on the ground. So is there research? Are there government departments focusing on adaptation? Those kind of things. So I want to see it applied more broadly.
Perspective, the questions that we can add to that are these all equal? So are some sufficient if you need funding for anything else to matter? So we've looked at predictors of adaptation and found, for example, if a nation doesn't have good governance, nothing else matters. Doesn't matter how much money you have, doesn't matter how much leadership you have, that governance is the basis. Asking these questions about these actually interact, well, we haven't asked it, but it would be a good question. We could, standing up here and thinking about it. I don't even need wine. We could actually find out whether these are not necessarily independent, but are some predicated on the presence of others, for example, at different scales. That's what predictors research would link in with this, which is more it's been more qualitative.
Let's to move forward with this. I've never been able to get any students to actually work on this, so Joanne's the first one to come along and say, hey, I want to work on this kind of approach, which is great. So I really want to move forward with this and see how well it works and how useful it is.
Supportive. I'm only recently liking the idea, so I have been holding James back from his grand adaptation readiness idea.
For the conclusion of this seminar, that you come back to this slide, which is very highlights probably the potential of your team to also work on adaptation. Yeah. Going from science to, and I think you have lunch afterwards and possibly discuss about this question. Yeah. Because for example, for our organization, we're getting more questions about does the science triggered by URANOS makes a difference? Is there action on the ground? So the questions are becoming more and more intense as it goes along. And it's quite challenging. We've seen all kinds of occasions where science was not used, all kinds of occasions where science was used. And to conclude that example, I mean, I don't know if people noticed in the last Quebec budget, there was 6 million or 8 million that was announced for coastal probably a check in a number of initiatives on adaptation coming out of Quebec. But the reason why this $8 million is there is very intriguing. The reason why this $8 million is there is because, Quebec City asked for François Morneau and myself to go and present to an assembly of mayors, 4 years around the St. Lawrence. We small opportunity to present climate change, etc. And there came kind of a political distance between municipalities and the provincial government, which went well, sometimes did not go very well. At the end of the day, we ended up with an announcement of the Quebec government to support municipalities. If it was not from that presentation, I think there would be an adaptation action to add. So just say that the process is sometimes and we need to better understand how to do this in order to have action plans that are adapted
having priorities on who to talk to, who to present science to. So I want to conclude with that. And again, thank you for your visit of your group to present some of your work.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks. I'm sorry. I have read the presentation.
Do you want my email?
If you want, I can give you the FTP site.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yes.
Do you want to write it down? Or you can email it to me.
Yeah. People want to see it, I can diffuse it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
James.George.
I could have given him that.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
How are you?
Good.
Thank you very much for
Thanks. I know the problem. I don't know what it is you do, but